This is a story worth every second of your time. The summons went out with the force of a thunderclap across Washington. An emergency hearing, called not for policy or posturing, but for a reckoning. The marble columns of the Capitol seemed to lean inward, as if the building itself was bracing for impact. The subject was brutal in its clarity, investigating systemic corruption, exposing the lawyers who had turned financial fraud into a dark art. At the heart of it all sat a name America could not forget: Michael Cohen. Once the whisper in every gilded hallway, now the man dragged into the light by the weight of his own betrayals. Cameras packed the hearing room like vultures, lenses wide and hungry for blood. Congressional staffers shifted nervously in their seats, sensing the storm Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. The nation wasn't here for compromise. It was here for truth, sharpened to a blade. Every second ticked louder than the last, an invisible drumbeat announcing that something was about to break. Jasmine Crockett entered the hearing chamber without fanfare. Yet the air changed the moment she crossed the threshold. She wore no armor but her presence, no weapons but her voice, and yet the temperature seemed to drop 3 degrees. Every eye snapped to her: reporters, lawmakers, aides. Even the marble busts of forgotten leaders seemed to tilt toward her, as if history itself were paying attention. She carried a thick folder under her arm, the edges bristling with classified documents, sealed indictments, and financial trails that glowed like lit fuses. Today, the old games of money and silence would not save anyone. Michael Cohen would answer for the empire he helped build, or he would burn with it. Jasmine paused only once, her hand brushing lightly against the polished oak table, where justice at long last would be demanded. She did not smile. She did not blink. She was not here to debate. She was here to demolish. The silence that swallowed the room after Jasmine's challenge was broken only by the soft, deliberate creak of the chamber door. Michael Cohen entered like a man walking onto a battlefield he could not escape. His suit, once a symbol of his polished power, hung awkwardly on him now, as if it too had grown tired of the weight he carried. His face, once so practiced in arrogance, was pale and drawn, his eyes darting not with confidence, but calculation, flickering from Jasmine to the cameras, to the rows of lawmakers waiting like a firing squad. Each step he took seemed to hesitate just a fraction longer than necessary, as though part of him wished he could still turn back, disappear into the marble shadows. But there was no escape now. The world had cornered him, and Jasmine Crockett stood ready to light the fire. His fingers twitched at the folder he clutched. Empty gestures of control that convinced no one. This wasn't the Michael Cohen who once threatened journalists and greased political wheels. This was a man stripped of allies, stripped of armor, dragged naked before the conscience of a nation. And in the way his jaw tightened as he approached the witness table, there was one final, desperate truth. He would not go down without trying to rewrite the story, even now. For a moment, just a heartbeat, the room itself seemed to slip backward into memory. Flashes of Michael Cohen's past flared like sparks in a dry forest. In smoky back rooms, his voice had slithered through negotiations, promising protection to the highest bidder. In shadowed bank offices, he had drawn up shell companies like a magician pulling rabbits from thin air. False fronts to hide millions, transactions built like puzzles no outsider could solve. A whisper here, a threat there, a signature slipped across a table with a smile too sharp to be sincere. Cohen had not simply played the game of corruption. He had designed the board it was played on and sold the pieces to anyone willing to pay. Behind every real estate scam, every inflated asset, every hidden account, there was his hand, careful, invisible, deadly. And for years, the world had let him slip by because he spoke the language of wealth, because he shook the right hands and crushed the right enemies. But not today. Today, the marble walls would not shield him. Today, the old ghosts he had once conjured for others would rise. And Jasmine Crockett, standing like judgment itself, was ready to force every last one of them into the light. The room seemed to hold its breath as Michael Cohen settled into the witness chair, the hollow scrape of wood against marble slicing through the tense silence. His hands fumbled slightly with the papers in front of him, but no document could shield him now. Across the expanse of polished oak, Jasmine Crockett straightened slowly, every movement deliberate, as if drawing back the string of a bow. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Cohen's with a precision that made even seasoned reporters flinch behind their cameras. There was no hesitation in her posture, no veneer of political courtesy, only the inevitability of confrontation, humming in the stale air like the crackle before a storm. Cohen licked his lips once, an involuntary twitch that betrayed the rising tide of dread clawing up his spine. He had faced prosecutors before, had danced through depositions and inquiries, but this was different. Jasmine was not hunting a headline. She was hunting something far rarer, the truth he had buried long ago. She didn't waste a second. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low but slicing through the air like tempered steel. "Mr. Cohen," she said, every syllable hammered into the silence. A man who understood the law better than most, yet chose to grind it under his heel. Why? The question hit the room like a detonation, sharp, sudden, and leaving no safe place to hide. A murmur ran through the gallery, a ripple of shock that even decades of political theater could not suppress. For a moment after Jasmine's words fell like a hammer onto the room, nothing moved. Even the air seemed frozen in place, heavy with anticipation, almost crackling with the weight of what was about to happen. Every pair of eyes, from seasoned senators to jittery junior aides, locked onto Michael Cohen as if the force of their stares alone could peel the truth from his skin. Cohen sat motionless at first, his breathing shallow, the thin veneer of composure stretched tight across his face, ready to tear. Under the ruthless assault of the lights and cameras, his defenses, so meticulously built over years of courtroom battles and backroom deals, began to crumble. He blinked, swallowed hard, glanced down at the papers before him like they might offer an escape. But there were no words on earth that could save him from what Jasmine Crockett had unleashed. He shifted in his seat, a small, twitchy movement that only made the silence scream louder. Then, almost reluctantly, as if dragged to the gallows, he spoke. His voice was low, frayed at the edges, the voice of a man trying to thread a needle of sympathy through a fabric soaked in guilt. "I was following orders," Cohen said, his voice spilling out too fast, too thin, as if trying to outrun the shame curling behind every word. He darted a glance at the committee members, hoping for some flicker of understanding, but found only cold stone. "You have to understand, the environment we were in, the expectations, everyone knew how the game was played," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about survival, about loyalty. You cut corners, you bend the rules because that's what the system demands." He raised a hand as if trying to shield himself from the weight of their stares. "It wasn't just me," he insisted, his voice fraying at the edges. "It was the culture. It was normal. If you didn't play along, you didn't survive." But the chamber was merciless. No one leaned forward with sympathy. In the hard, unsparing eyes that stared back at him, Cohen could already see the verdict writing itself. No matter how he twisted it, the man who had weaponized corruption could not now hide behind claims of victimhood. Still, he pressed on, clinging to the lie of helplessness. He spoke of pressures, of the slow corrosion of right and wrong in rooms where power needed no morality. But every excuse only made him smaller, more invisible, already fading from the story he thought he controlled. His voice cracked once, just slightly when he said, "I didn't have a choice," and the chamber seemed to recoil in silent disgust. Of all the lies he had spun in his lifetime, perhaps this was the most naked. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless across from him, her gaze steady, a blade she had no need to swing, because Cohen was slicing himself apart with every desperate syllable. In that courtroom of history, where facts mattered more than theatrics, Michael Cohen had become the perfect witness against himself. A man who built an empire of deceit, now reduced to a broken architect trying to blame the bricks. And as his final excuse withered and fell dead between them, Jasmine Crockett moved, not with anger, but with the merciless calm of someone who had heard every lie 1,000 times before and was ready to end them with a single cut. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her movement so controlled, so deliberate, it felt more like the drawing of a blade than the shifting of a posture. Her voice when it came was quiet, not a shout, not an accusation, but something far worse, the final, irrevocable truth. Pressure doesn't create thieves, Jasmine said, her words slicing through the stale tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It reveals them. The sentence landed not like an explosion, but like a slow, brutal breaking. The crack of something deep inside Cohen giving way at last. A collective shiver seemed to move through the room, as if the very air recoiled from the nakedness of the moment. Cohen's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. His excuses, his practiced defenses, all turned to ash in the face of a truth too pure and too sharp to deny. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't need to. Her words had been enough to strip him bare in front of a nation that now saw him not as a victim, not even as a villain, but as something infinitely smaller. A man who had chosen corruption, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. The cameras zoomed closer, greedy to catch every flicker of collapse. And still Jasmine sat, composed and unflinching, the embodiment of a justice that had waited too long, but had not forgotten. The aftershock of Jasmine's last words still hung over the room like a silent roar when she moved again, slower than before, every motion deliberate and filled with quiet devastation. She didn't glance at the audience. She didn't look to the committee or the cameras. Her focus stayed locked on Michael Cohen, and in that unbroken stare was the promise of something worse than condemnation: exposure. Without rushing, without grandstanding, Jasmine reached down and retrieved a thick, sealed file from the table before her, the folder's edges slightly worn, as if it had traveled a long road to get here. The fluorescent lights caught the metal clasp as she flicked it open with a soft, metallic snap, a sound so sharp it seemed to ripple across the chamber. The journalists pressed closer against the rope barriers, their cameras whirring into a frenzy, sensing what was coming. Even the lawmakers shifted in their seats, their practiced masks of indifference slipping slightly. There was no yelling, no flourish, only the chilling finality of evidence about to be laid bare. Jasmine placed the folder on the table and slid it forward, her fingers barely brushing the surface, as if even she found the contents too heavy to fully hold. And in that simple, devastating movement, the temperature of the room dropped another degree. Her voice when she spoke again was low, controlled, without an ounce of wasted breath. "You spoke of pressure, Mr. Cohen," she said, flipping open the first page with a whisper of paper. "You spoke of culture. Let's talk about what you created." She began to read, each word deliberate, each line a blade. Company name, Goldstone Holdings, registered at a non-existent address in Newark, New Jersey. Owner, shell entity tied to a defunct firm in Belize. She turned another page without pausing. Company name, Blue Ridge Ventures. Wire transfers totaling $7.4 million, funneled through accounts in the Cayman Islands, never reported to the IRS. Another page fluttered under her fingers. Company name, Hawthorne Consulting. Payments masked as consulting fees. But the invoices are blank. No services rendered. No staff on record. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Each fact struck like a hammer. Calm, relentless, merciless. Jasmine's words painted the picture clearly, not of a man forced by circumstances, but of an architect who had engineered corruption with steady hands and an unshaken will. And Cohen, trapped under the brutal floodlight of truth, could do nothing now but drown. But even as the weight of his hidden empire lay exposed on the table, Jasmine was not finished. She had saved the sharpest blade for last. The final document slid to a stop on the table like the last card in a losing game. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not even close. She let the heavy silence stretch a moment longer, watching Michael Cohen's chest rise and fall too quickly, his mouth twitching with barely controlled panic. Then, with the same cold control she had shown all along, she shifted gears. The energy in the room changed instantly, sharper and colder as Jasmine reached for a second, smaller file marked by a plain red tab. Everything before had been tightening the noose, and now she was ready to pull it. She tapped the folder once on the table, the sound soft but sharp, slicing through the room like a warning shot. The shell companies, Jasmine said, her voice even and cutting, were only the beginning. She slid the red-tabbed file to the center of the table and let it sit there like a bomb about to explode. Then in a voice so low and deliberate that everyone leaned in to hear, she delivered the blow. You are on the classified target list of a secret IRS investigation. Codename, Operation Taxman. The effect was immediate, even though no one in the room moved a muscle. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out, replaced by something heavier and more dangerous. Cohen blinked rapidly, as if trying to convince himself he had heard wrong. But there was no mistake. Operation Taxman, a secret federal operation so tightly guarded that no reporter, no senator, no one outside a handful of officials had even known it existed until this very moment. Jasmine's words didn't just shake Cohen, they shattered him. She pressed on, her tone clinical, merciless. A multi-year investigation into major tax fraud, money laundering, and illegal shell networks, built by people who thought they were too powerful to be touched, she said, her gaze locking Cohen in place like a trap. And you, Mr. Cohen, were one of the first names entered into that sealed file. Every word landed harder than the last, stacking onto his chest like heavy stones, crushing the last scraps of denial he had left. He sat frozen, surrounded by the ruins of the lies he had built, while Jasmine, calm and relentless, watched as the truth finally drowned him. The silence after Jasmine's last revelation stretched so tight it seemed the air itself might tear. Cohen sat motionless, blinking as if the words classified IRS operation might rearrange themselves into something less fatal if he just refused to process them. The cameras clicked faster now, capturing every twitch of his fingers, every shallow rise and fall of his chest. Jasmine gave him no mercy, no room to retreat into denial. She allowed the silence to suffocate him a second longer, then leaned in with a stillness that was more terrifying than any shout. Her voice was calm, unshaken, almost clinical as she spoke, but the words themselves cut deeper than any blade. "Mr. Cohen," she said, her gaze locking him down like an iron vice. "Do you know why your tax fraud file was quietly transferred into a federal covert operation known as Operation Taxman?" She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She let the question hang there, jagged and bleeding, daring him to answer, knowing he couldn't. The explosion wasn't loud. It was electric. A ripple of shock tore through the hearing room, invisible but undeniable. Journalists jolted in their seats, the quiet murmur of whispered questions rising into a sudden, chaotic buzz. Hands scrambled for recording devices, cameras zoomed and refocused with frantic urgency, capturing every microscopic detail of the moment the floor dropped out beneath Michael Cohen. Behind the committee members' stoic faces, even the most battle-hardened politicians stiffened at the name. Operation Taxman, it wasn't just another investigation. It was a silent storm, gathering strength for years in the corridors of federal power, designed to crush sprawling empires of hidden wealth, black money, and untouchable names. And now, thanks to Jasmine Crockett, the whole world knew that Michael Cohen wasn't a small piece caught by accident. He was a marked target from the very beginning. Cohen's face drained of color so fast it seemed almost theatrical. But there was no acting left in him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. Just a shallow, rattling breath that barely filled his lungs. He knew. Jasmine could see it. Everyone could see it. He understood, maybe for the first time, that he wasn't simply facing public humiliation or political damage. He was facing the full, crushing weight of a federal machine that had moved against him quietly, methodically, without giving him the slightest chance to defend himself. And Jasmine, calm, sharp, unrelenting, wasn't merely a prosecutor today. She was the messenger of that machine, and her message was devastatingly clear. You are not special. You are not protected. You are prey. The cameras caught every second of it. The tremble at the corner of Cohen's mouth, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table as if trying to anchor himself against the rising tide. Jasmine allowed the moment to stretch, knowing exactly what she was doing, knowing that some truths didn't need to be shouted. They just needed to be delivered with precision, like a surgeon cutting into rotten flesh. Operation Taxman, she said, her voice low but carrying with absolute authority, is a national task force designed to dismantle large-scale networks of tax evasion, shell companies, and money laundering, especially those connected to high-ranking figures and political elites. She let that sink in, watching Cohen flinch like a man cornered by a predator he had never believed would dare strike him. It was built for people who thought they were too powerful to be touched, she added, her words slicing through the room with deadly precision. People like you. The buzz from the press gallery surged again, reporters scribbling furiously, their faces pale with the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Cohen barely seemed to hear them. His world had shrunk down to a single point. Jasmine Crockett's voice, steady and merciless, driving the final nails into a coffin he had built with his own greed. He knew, even before she said it, that escape was no longer possible. No backroom deals, no political favors, no clever lawyers twisting words into lifelines. Jasmine didn't even have to raise her voice. She simply let the facts do the work, and the facts were merciless. You were one of the first names entered into the sealed ledger, Mr. Cohen, Jasmine continued, her tone sharpened to a razor's edge. You weren't an accident. You weren't a side target. You were the blueprint. Her words were measured, each one heavier than the last, hammering Cohen deeper into the ground. Every shell company you created, every false invoice you filed, every dollar you laundered through offshore accounts. It's all in there, cataloged, cross-referenced, and waiting for the courts to finish what Operation Taxman started. She said it without anger, without triumph, just cold, clean truth. Because in that moment, the truth was the only weapon left, and it was more lethal than anything Cohen had ever imagined. For a few seconds, it seemed Cohen might speak, might beg, might throw out some desperate defense. But then he sagged back in his chair, the fight leaking out of him in a slow, pitiful collapse. The camera zoomed in, catching every second of his unraveling. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't offer any mercy. She simply sat there, steady and unsparing, letting the silence punish him harder than any words could. Around them, the room crackled with the energy of a nation watching a corrupt empire crumble. Not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding fall into ruin. And still, Jasmine held his gaze. Still, she didn't look away. Because today wasn't about anger or vengeance. It was about justice finally finding its mark. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Cohen sagging in his chair, the cameras devouring his collapse, the audience caught between breath and disbelief. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, a movement so small yet so heavy it felt like a closing trap. Her voice came out steady, sharp, impossible to escape. Who coordinated, Mr. Cohen? She asked, her words slicing straight through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. Who protected you while you built these cross-border networks of shell companies and black money? The question was a hammer blow, impossible to dodge, each syllable nailing Cohen tighter to the floor. He swallowed hard, visibly flinching under the fluorescent lights that now seemed to spotlight every crack in his defenses. His mouth opened, a desperate reflex, but no answers came rushing out. Only the shallow, empty gasps of a man realizing the walls were too thick, the ceiling too low, and the doors long since locked. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness, her certainty, filled the space between them like a tide rising past Cohen's chin. There was nowhere left to run, and nowhere left to hide. Cohen tried anyway. He shifted in his seat, hands fluttering at invisible notes, his gaze darting between committee members, like a man looking for a friendly face and finding only stone. I was following instructions from business partners, he stammered, the words brittle, collapsing under their own weight as soon as they left his lips. Pressure, expectations. It was the environment, not... His voice trailed off, dying in the heavy air Jasmine had weaponized so expertly. Every excuse he clung to sounded smaller, more pathetic, each syllable more hollow than the last. The journalist leaned forward, smelling the blood in the water, their pens flying across notebooks, cameras zooming in to catch every miserable twitch of Cohen's face. Jasmine didn't flinch. She watched him quietly, like a predator giving its prey one last chance to exhaust itself before the inevitable strike. The silence that followed was merciless, a jury that needed no deliberation. Cohen's shoulders sagged a little more, the fight draining out of him with each useless protest. There was no misunderstanding anymore. The game was over, and he had lost. The silence that followed Cohen's last week protest was total, heavy, suffocating, final. No one moved. No one spoke. The cameras rolled in a quiet frenzy, capturing every raw second as Cohen sat there, hollowed out by the weight of the truth pressing against him from all sides. And still Jasmine Crockett waited, patient and merciless, giving him no lifeline, offering him no space to slip away. It wasn't cruelty, it was justice. She knew, everyone knew, that if he was going to break, it had to be here, under the relentless pressure of the truth he had spent a lifetime outrunning. Cohen blinked slowly, like a man trying to find oxygen in a room with no air left. His fingers trembled against the table, and for a moment it seemed like he might hold the line. But when he finally opened his mouth, the words didn't come out in a shout or a protest. They came out as a slow, broken surrender. "I wasn't alone," Cohen said, the words rasping out of him like they had to be dragged over broken glass. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at anyone. His gaze dropped to the table, to the mess of papers that document his downfall in merciless detail. There were networks, he muttered, his voice low, raw, almost unrecognizable. Shell companies, offshore accounts. It wasn't just about hiding money. He swallowed hard, the motion painful, his Adam's apple bobbing like a drowning man fighting for breath. It was about moving it, laundering it. He gripped the edge of the table tighter, knuckles whitening, as if he could hold on to something. Anything, to stop the truth from spilling out faster. There were politicians, CEOs investment groups, big names, people who needed their money invisible. His voice cracked at the edges, the reality too massive to frame neatly. And I helped them. I built the bridges they walked across. For 10 years, I kept the system greased so no one would ever get caught. A ripple of pure shock moved through the chamber. Not noise, not motion, but something deeper, a collective realization that what they were hearing was far worse than any had anticipated. Jasmine didn't blink. She let Cohen's words fill the space between them, the air growing thicker, heavier with every syllable he gave up. Cohen shifted miserably in his seat, running a hand across his face like he could somehow wipe away the confession now hanging between them. His entire body seemed to sag under the weight of what he had finally admitted. The years spent as a ghost in the system, making sure the rich and powerful could act without consequence, while the rest of the world lived under a different set of rules. He wasn't a pawn. He wasn't a victim. He had been the architect of a machinery built to launder greed into untouchable wealth. And now, under Jasmine's unblinking gaze, he could no longer hide behind crafted denials and well-paid silences. "You moved billions," Jasmine said, her voice still steady, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You built tunnels no one could see, not even the regulators, not even the tax courts. You didn't just protect the money, you erased it." Cohen flinched at the bluntness of it, but he didn't deny it. How could he? The facts sat in front of him, a tidal wave made of ink and paper, and numbers that didn't lie. The lights overhead seemed to burn hotter now, or maybe it was just the fire of exposure finally eating through the lies he had wrapped around himself for so long. Cohen let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob, but no one in the room moved to comfort him. No one offered him the dignity of pity. He had traded that away, transaction by transaction, over the long, invisible years when he thought no one would ever see him for what he truly was. Slowly, painfully, Cohen began listing names. He didn't shout them. He didn't dramatize them. He spoke them the way a prisoner counts the links of a chain around his own neck. Methodical, resigned, exhausted. Company executives, political donors, international banking officers. Jasmine scribbled nothing down. She had already prepared for this. She knew what he would say, even if no one else in the room had truly been ready to hear it. And yet hearing it spill from Cohen's own broken voice made the crimes real in a way no report or expose ever could. These were not just vague acts of corruption. These were networks with faces, families, election campaigns, and luxury addresses, all stitched together by greed and the false promise that the law would never touch them. The room remained silent, save for Cohen's strained breathing and the quiet clicks of cameras immortalizing his downfall. Jasmine allowed him to finish without interruption. There was no need to rush the death spiral of a lie finally giving way to truth. When Cohen finally stopped talking, the silence returned. Not as a pause this time, but as a verdict. He sagged back into his chair, his hands useless and limp against the tabletop. A man undone by his own survival instincts turned against him. Jasmine remained steady across from him, her hands folded neatly, her face unreadable. The embodiment of the justice he had thought he could outrun. And for the first time in the entire hearing, Michael Cohen looked small. Not just guilty, not just defeated. Small, a man who had spent a decade building bridges for kings, only to drown under the weight of their secrets. The silence after Cohen's confession wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, almost alive, pressing down on everyone in the room. It would have been easy for Jasmine to end it there, to let Cohen drown in his own admissions, to let the cameras record the slow, pitiful collapse of a man who thought himself untouchable. But Jasmine Crockett had not come here just for truth. She had come for accountability. And so, with the same calm precision she had wielded all morning, she leaned forward slightly, her presence cutting across the table like the edge of a blade drawn from its sheath. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. In its steadiness, in its terrible certainty, it carried more force than a gavel slamming down from the bench. "You didn't just betray the law, Mr. Cohen," Jasmine said, her tone sharp enough to leave a scar. "You sold out democracy itself for greed." The words sliced through the chamber, and the ripple they sent through the crowd was almost physical. A jolt, a collective intake of breath, as if something sacred had just been named and laid bare. Cohen visibly recoiled, his body shrinking even further into his chair, but Jasmine pressed forward, giving him no shelter from the storm she unleashed. "Every time you shifted a dollar, every shell company you built, every signature you forged, you weren't just stealing money," she continued, each word deliberate, each phrase like a nail hammered into the coffin of his illusions. "You were dismantling the very idea that the law could be trusted, that power had limits, that truth mattered." Her words moved through the room like wildfire, igniting silent outrage in every corner. Senators stiffening in their seats, journalists scribbling with renewed ferocity, even the guards at the back of the room standing a little straighter. Jasmine's eyes never left Cohen's face, and Cohen, once the master of deals and whispered threats, now looked like nothing more than a frightened man caught in the final collapse of his own empire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth she spoke crashed against him harder than any shouted accusation could have. "You betrayed the millions who believed that justice applied equally," Jasmine said, her voice tightening just slightly. The only betrayal of the fire burning beneath her control. "You showed the world that for the right price, the law was just another asset to be bought and sold." Cohen lowered his eyes, unable or unwilling to meet the storm he had unleashed. The papers on the table between them, the evidence, the names, the figures, seemed to burn under the harsh light of reality, no longer just numbers and transactions, but the wreckage of trust itself. Jasmine allowed the silence to stretch, allowed him to sit with what he had done, the enormity of it settling onto his hunched shoulders like chains. She knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system he had served, the corruption he had fueled, and the truth that needed to be spoken aloud for the sake of every citizen who believed the law should mean something more than power. The cameras continued to record every agonizing second, capturing the raw collapse of a man stripped of every pretense. Cohen's breathing grew shallow, his hands twitching slightly against the wood of the table, as if searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left. Jasmine had made sure of that. She straightened slightly, her presence expanding, until it seemed to fill every corner of the chamber. "Your greed wasn't private," she said, her words cutting so cleanly that Cohen flinched. "It infected the system. It weakened the walls meant to protect ordinary people from the ambitions of the powerful." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It carried the cold, relentless clarity of a knife pushed slowly but inexorably deeper into flesh. "And you did it with your eyes wide open, Mr. Cohen. You didn't stumble into corruption. You built a career on it." The weight of her words settled like a second atmosphere over the hearing room, heavy and unrelenting. Cohen seemed to shrink even further into himself, his shoulders curling inward, his hands now clasped tightly in his lap, like a man awaiting judgment he already knew he couldn't escape. The journalists had gone nearly silent, their pens frozen mid-sentence, their cameras capturing the stillness of a man unmade by the truth. Jasmine allowed the silence to stretch again, knowing the power of it, knowing that sometimes the absence of sound could speak louder than any shouting match. She let the image of him, small, defeated, exposed, imprint itself on every mind watching, a living testimony to what unchecked greed looked like when stripped of its golden armor. Finally, Jasmine leaned back slightly, her gaze never wavering, her voice steady and cold. "This isn't just your shame," she said, her words falling into the charged air like heavy stones. "It's the stain you helped spread across every institution you touched, across every law you twisted, across every citizen you betrayed." There was no anger in her voice, only an implacable finality, the kind that offered no escape, no forgiveness, no revision of the record. In that moment, Cohen wasn't just a disgraced lawyer or a fallen fixer. He was the embodiment of a deeper rot, dragged out into the light by a woman who had refused to look away. And no matter how many millions he had moved, no matter how many politicians he had protected, or how many loopholes he had exploited, here in this room, under this weight, he was finally irrevocably small. The final words hung in the air long after Jasmine finished speaking, a silence heavier than any verdict. The world had watched Michael Cohen shrink, watched the full weight of his betrayal laid bare under the cold, merciless precision of Jasmine Crockett's cross-examination. But the reckoning wasn't contained within the four walls of the chamber. It was already leaking out. Through the cameras, through the whispered texts of aides, through the breaking news banners erupting across every major network. Like a fault line snapping under years of pressure, America trembled, and then it erupted. By the time the hearing adjourned, the rotunda outside the Capitol was already a frenzy. Journalists barked questions into roaring microphones, desperate to capture reactions in real time. Protesters filled the steps and sidewalks, their handmade signs punching the sky with angry colors. "No one above the law. Corruption is treason. Jasmine spoke for us." Cable news anchors, breathless and blinking against the chaos, stumbled through live coverage as the crowd outside grew into a living, breathing force of fury and disbelief. Every major network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, abandoned scheduled programming to stream footage from the hearing on endless loop. Jasmine's voice, cool and lethal, played over and over. "You didn't just betray the law, you sold out democracy itself for greed." It wasn't a statement anymore. It was a spark thrown into a field of dry anger waiting for ignition. Social media detonated. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's name was trending globally, eclipsing entertainment, sports, even international news. Clips of her confrontation with Cohen were cut, shared, and reposted millions of times. Memes flooded the internet. Images of Jasmine wielding a gavel like a sword, captions that simply read, "Justice served cold." Commentators across the spectrum, from progressive pundits to traditionally cautious centrists, hailed her performance as a watershed moment. "For the first time in years," one anchor said on live TV, his voice cracking with emotion, "we watched someone drag the rot into the light and refuse to blink. In coffee shops, office break rooms, living rooms across America, ordinary citizens leaned closer to their screens, feeling a pulse they had not felt in a long time. The pulse of accountability fighting its way back into public life. Yet beneath the explosion of righteous anger, there was another current, a deeper, darker rumble of reckoning. High-rise law firms scrambled to review their client lists, government agencies prepared internal statements, and financial institutions quietly convened emergency meetings. Everyone who had profited from the old system, who had thrived in the shadow world Cohen had helped build, felt the earth shift beneath their feet. They had seen the look in Jasmine Crockett's eyes, not of vengeance, but of a truth so cold and relentless it would not be bargained with. And they understood. This wasn't just about one man's fall. It was about a wall of protection built over decades, now showing cracks too large to ignore. Inside political war rooms across Washington, strategists huddled around flickering screens, parsing every word Jasmine had spoken, calculating how much of the old guard could be saved and how much would have to burn. Allies of the exposed panicked quietly behind closed doors, issuing statements that condemned Cohen while desperately distancing themselves from the networks he had implicated. But no amount of spin could contain the force Jasmine had unleashed. It wasn't just Michael Cohen on trial anymore. It was an entire era. Back on the Capitol steps, as the sun set behind the marble columns, the crowd kept growing. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and Jasmine's words crackled over the noise, each syllable punching the evening air. "You didn't stumble into corruption. You built a career on it." Cheers erupted from the protesters. Strangers hugged each other, tears streaming down faces weathered by too many years of watching justice slip through their fingers. A woman in her 70s, clutching an American flag to her chest, whispered to a reporter, "This is what truth sounds like. I thought I'd never hear it again." Inside her office, away from the chaos she had ignited, Jasmine Crockett sat alone for a moment, staring out at the night. Her hands were still, her breathing steady, but the room around her seemed to hum with the aftershock of what she had done. She knew this wasn't the end. One hearing wouldn't fix a system that had been allowed to rot from the inside for so long. But it was a crack, and cracks, if hit hard enough, became breaks. She had aimed for the fault line, and she had struck true. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't raged. She had simply refused to be silent. And America, battered and cynical as it had become, had listened. The night deepened outside, but the streets stayed alive. A river of voices refusing to go home, refusing to let the moment pass without seizing it. Jasmine watched the distant lights flicker and move, not as chaos, but as proof that somewhere underneath the anger, underneath the outrage, the old bones of democracy were stirring again. Broken, battered, but not dead. Not yet. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Not a smile of triumph, a smile of beginning. The fire Jasmine Crockett had ignited refused to die with the setting sun. Across the country, the hearing played on endless repeat. In airports, in diners, on giant digital screens in Times Square, flickering like a warning shot against the night sky. But it wasn't just the fall of Michael Cohen that held the nation captive. It was the woman behind the fall. Jasmine Crockett, sharp, fearless, relentless, had stepped into a system many believed too corrupted to touch and ripped the mask off its hidden machinery. And America, cynical and battered though it was, recognized the truth when it heard it spoken without apology. News anchors called her a force of nature. Editorials compared her to icons of past political reckonings. Politicians scrambled to issue statements of support, desperate to ride the tidal wave she had unleashed. But it wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something older. The fragile, rising hope that maybe, just maybe, the machinery of democracy still had a pulse left. The name Operation Taxman became a rallying cry overnight. But it wasn't the operation itself that seized the imagination of a restless public. It was what Jasmine had done with it. She hadn't just exposed the hidden players, the billionaires, the corporate raiders, the silent donors who bought their way into impunity. She had shown the country, line by brutal line, how the walls around justice had been quietly hollowed out and sold to the highest bidder. In coffee shops and town halls, in late-night debates across social media, Americans began to ask the questions they had once been too tired or too afraid to voice. Who else? How deep? How long had the rot gone unnoticed? Or worse, unchallenged? And everywhere, woven into the heart of those conversations, was the name Jasmine Crockett. No longer just a congresswoman, but a symbol of the fight that had been dormant too long. It wasn't just talk. Action followed, swift and chaotic. Financial oversight bills that had languished for years were dragged back into debate, dusted off under a new, glaring spotlight. Investigative journalists uncovered networks of lobbyists and offshore accounts tied to names that had once seemed untouchable. Protests formed not just outside courthouses, but outside the homes of corporate executives, demanding accountability beyond courtroom settlements. The message was clear and simple. The era of silent complicity was over. And at the center of it all, echoing louder than any headline, was a single line Jasmine had delivered offhandedly in the aftermath of the hearing. A line that had captured the spirit of the moment like a match to dry tinder. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. The phrase swept across the country like a battle flag. It appeared on banners at rallies, painted across overpasses, printed on T-shirts and bumper stickers. Protesters shouted it through bullhorns in city streets. College students chalked it onto sidewalks in front of administration buildings, and retired veterans stitched it onto flags they carried into state capitals. The words had weight because they spoke a truth too long, whispered but never declared so plainly. Greed had become law, and now finally rebellion had become duty. Jasmine hadn't just uncovered corruption, she had reawakened something fundamental. The belief that fighting for fairness wasn't naive, wasn't futile, wasn't dead. It was necessary. The backlash was swift and brutal, of course. Power rarely surrendered without a fight. Conservative media called Jasmine reckless, dangerous, an agent of chaos. Wealthy donors whispered threats behind closed doors, warning of political consequences for anyone who stood with her. Anonymous smear campaigns spread online, attacking her credibility, her past, even her family. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted beyond their control. Jasmine had not built her movement on polished slogans or manufactured outrage. She had built it on evidence, cold, undeniable, and public. Every attack against her only confirmed what millions had already seen, that she had struck a nerve no one else had dared touch. Inside the marble walls of Congress, where compromise had too often meant concession, the atmosphere changed in ways subtle but profound. Allies began to speak louder. Rivals hesitated before dismissing her. Committee chairs who had once seen her as a firebrand now saw her as a force they could not afford to ignore. The old rules, rules that had protected the rich and silenced the persistent, trembled under the new scrutiny Jasmine had unleashed. And even as the political machine churned and plotted its resistance, the people outside kept marching, kept chanting, kept demanding. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. Through it all, Jasmine remained steady, refusing to be baited into spectacle or hollow victory laps. She gave no grand speeches. She granted few interviews. She let the work and the movement speak louder than any press conference ever could. In private, she knew the battle was far from over. Exposing a network was one thing. Breaking it would be another. But for the first time in a long time, she also knew she wasn't fighting alone. Across cities and fields, across generational and political divides, a current had been sparked. Not blind outrage, not partisan fury, a slow, stubborn, rising refusal to let corruption wear the mask of normalcy ever again. And somewhere deep inside the rising storm she had called into being, Jasmine Crockett stood exactly where she had always intended to be. At the fault line where silence had shattered, speaking the words no one could unhear. Victory smelled different than Jasmine Crockett had ever imagined. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't triumphant. It was thick, metallic, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm when you know the lightning is coming, but you can't see it yet. Sitting alone in her office hours after the hearing ended, she could still hear the distant echo of her own voice playing on TV screens across America. She could feel the rumble of protest rolling down city streets. She could see her name flashing like a lit match across social media feeds. Jasmine Crockett, the woman who stood alone and cracked the spine of corruption wide open. But in the heavy silence of the room, stripped of applause and headlines, She felt only the weight, a slow, grinding awareness that what she had started was bigger, messier, and far more dangerous than anything the cameras could capture. She shifted in her chair, the old leather creaking beneath her, and stared out the tall windows where the city lights blurred into the humid night. Somewhere down there, thousands were chanting her name, hoisting signs demanding change. And yet here, in this quiet high above it all, Jasmine felt the battlefield stretching wider than any protest line could reach. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the blood-soaked beginning. The folder still sat open on her desk, the documents she had unveiled to the world now inert under a sterile desk lamp. Names, companies, accounts, blood trails disguised as spreadsheets. Jasmine dragged her fingers lightly over the top page, not to read it. She had memorized every line long before the hearing, but simply to remind herself that it was real, that she hadn't dreamed it, that she hadn't imagined the sick rot she had unearthed. Each name on those papers had lived, breathed, smiled on magazine covers, delivered keynotes at galas, toasted champagne behind closed doors, while building an empire on stolen money and stolen futures. And for too long, the world had bowed before them without ever daring to lift the curtain. Now the curtain was gone, ripped away by the hands of a woman they had never seen coming. The phone on her desk vibrated again, another endless call she wouldn't answer. Aides, reporters, allies, strangers. They all wanted a piece of the moment. They wanted sound bites. They wanted celebration. They wanted Jasmine to smile for the cameras, to bask in the triumph. But Jasmine didn't feel triumphant. She felt the sharp edge of reality cutting deeper into her gut with every passing minute. Exposing corruption was not the same as defeating it. Snakes didn't die when you dragged them into the light. They coiled tighter. They struck faster. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly through her nose, feeling the tension coil between her shoulder blades like a wire pulled too tight. Victory wasn't the end of fear. It was the start of new enemies. Enemies who had watched her from behind two-way mirrors. Enemies whose names weren't on any public record yet, but who now knew hers all too well. Jasmine's mind flickered back to the hearing, the way Michael Cohen had crumbled. Not like a man facing justice, but like a piece of a greater machine finally stripped of its cover. He hadn't fallen alone. She had seen the tremors ripple outward, the sudden phone calls from lobbyists, the canceled meetings, the tightened smiles in Capitol hallways. The system was bigger than Cohen, bigger than any one man. And now that she had cracked the surface, the whole trembling structure would either collapse or come crashing down on her head. The lamp buzzed slightly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the papers. For a fleeting second, she caught her own reflection in the dark window. A woman sitting still, hands folded, gaze hard and unflinching. But beneath the armor, she could feel it, the exhaustion clawing at her muscles, the quiet grief for a world that had allowed monsters to thrive so easily. For every Cohen dragged into daylight, there were 10 more waiting, their smiles sharper, their knives cleaner, their tracks covered better. Still, Jasmine knew she would not, could not turn away now. She stood slowly, the floor cold against her heels, and walked toward the window. Down below, the city vibrated with life, neon signs flashing, sirens wailing somewhere distant, protest chants carrying on the breeze like ancient battle cries. It looked alive. It sounded alive. But Jasmine knew better. Power hid in boardrooms and vaults and private jets, not on street corners. And power, when threatened, didn't debate. It retaliated. Her fingers touched the glass lightly, feeling the cool hum of it against her skin. Somewhere out there, she knew, they were already meeting. The hidden players who had once slept easy, now scrambling to decide what to do with the woman who had dared name them out loud. She pictured the smoky rooms, the whispered threats, the sharpened knives aimed not at her body, but at her credibility, her family, her future. And still, the thought didn't make her flinch. Because Jasmine Crockett had not come this far to bow. She had come to burn. Her mind whispered back her own words, the ones that now flooded the streets and the screens and the hearts of those who had waited too long for someone to speak without fear. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. The phrase wasn't just a rallying cry for the nation anymore. It was a shield she would carry into every battle still to come. It was the answer to every smear that would be hurled at her, every trap set in committee hearings, every threat scrawled in anonymous letters. It was the reminder that she did not stand alone. Behind her now stood millions, tired, angry, hopeful, ready. She pulled her jacket from the back of her chair, the fabric still carrying the faint, sweaty echo of the day's battle. She slipped it on with slow, deliberate movements, as if donning armor. Outside, the streets roared louder. Not a mob, not a riot, but a living testament that truth, once spoken clearly enough, could move mountains. Jasmine turned from the window. She clicked off the lamp, plunging the office into a cool, silver twilight lit only by the city's restless glow. She didn't need more light to see the path ahead. She knew it now. Jagged, dangerous, necessary. She walked toward the door, each step steady, deliberate, unshaken. The storm she had unleashed was only just beginning, and Jasmine Crockett, battle-scarred and unbreakable, walked straight into it. The victory Jasmine Crockett had carved out wasn't a shield. It was a target. She knew it the moment she stepped out of the hearing room and felt the air shift. The cheers outside were real, the gratitude raw and powerful. But somewhere behind the noise, the old machine had begun to move again, quietly, purposefully, dangerously. They had underestimated her once. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The first signs were almost invisible. Calls from longtime allies that suddenly went unanswered. Meetings delayed, then canceled without reason. Invitations to panels and fundraisers, once so frequent they blurred together, drying up overnight. Jasmine wasn't surprised. Power didn't attack in the open. It poisoned the air first, making it harder to breathe, harder to trust. In private rooms and silent exchanges, those threatened by what she had exposed began weaving their counterstrike. She wasn't facing just Cohen anymore. She was facing the entire ecosystem that had allowed him to thrive. The first blow landed in the media, a leak crafted with surgical malice, accusing Jasmine of conflicts of interest in cases she had touched years before. The allegations were thin, laughable even, but the point wasn't guilt. The point was to seed doubt, to shift the narrative from what she had uncovered to who she was. Jasmine watched it unfold on the news with an unflinching gaze, the edges of her resolve sharpening. This wasn't justice turning against her. This was fear, weaponized by the powerful, flailing to protect itself. Inside Congress, the walls began closing subtly around her. Colleagues who had praised her privately now avoided her publicly. Committee chairs whispered about the risk of distractions. Lobbyists tightened their networks, cutting her out of crucial negotiations. She could almost hear the machinery working. Old alliances rewiring themselves, money changing hands, favors being called in. Jasmine understood it instinctively. This was a siege, not a sudden strike, but a slow strangulation designed to bleed her influence away 1 inch at a time. And yet the more they pressed, the stronger she stood. She didn't lash out. She didn't play the victim. Instead, she turned methodical, building a new operation from scratch. Smaller, leaner, but unbreakable. She surrounded herself with aides who had seen real battles, not career politicians, but fighters who knew how to outlast storms. She tripled down on transparency, publishing every donation, every expenditure, every meeting, daring anyone to find a crack in her armor. She met every smear, not with outrage, but with overwhelming facts, flooding the field so thick with proof that lies drowned before they could take root. Outside the Capitol, the fire she had started burned hotter than ever. Town halls overflowed. Grassroots donations poured in. Her single phrase, "When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty," became more than a rallying cry. It became a movement. Across the country, local candidates began running on platforms of anti-corruption and financial reform. College students organized marches. Retired veterans waved handmade banners. Ordinary citizens, long ignored and forgotten, found their voices again. Jasmine had cracked the foundation, and through those cracks, the people had flooded in. But Jasmine never forgot. The old system was wounded, not dead. It would regroup. It would evolve. It would strike harder next time. Every step forward she took would be met with 10 more traps laid in her path. They would come for her funding. They would come for her reputation. They would come for her very sense of belonging in the halls of power she had dared to challenge. She understood this not with fear, but with the cold clarity of a soldier who knows the war is far from over. Late at night, when the world outside quieted and only the low hum of the city filled the air, Jasmine stood by her office window and let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. The loneliness, the danger, the endless grind of fighting not just enemies, but a system built to outlast any single challenger. But she also felt something else, something deeper and more immovable than fear. Conviction, the kind that couldn't be shaken by scandal or muted by backroom deals. The kind that didn't need polls or praise to survive. She whispered the words again, the ones that had carried her through every ambush, every betrayal, every sleepless night. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. And with that, Jasmine Crockett turned back to her desk, to the next battle plan, to the next war waiting just beyond the horizon. Because the machine wasn't done, but neither was she. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.